The call came down from the mountains like a physical blow, echoing off the walls of the temporary command post. A squad of Navy SEALs, hardened and grizzled, stood around a dusty map table, their faces illuminated by the cold glow of a laptop screen. The intelligence was stark. A village, deep in the Shock Valley, was about to be overrun. 9 high-value targets, heavily armed, were moving to execute a public execution of village elders who had cooperated with coalition forces. There was no time for a full battalion, no time for air support to get there before the sun set and the targets vanished into the maze of caves. They needed a small team, and they needed a miracle. Lieutenant Commander Marks, a man whose face was a roadmap of past deployments, looked at the assembled SEALs. "We're the closest. Wheels up in 10. He then gestured to a corner of the room where a solitary figure sat cross-legged on the floor, meticulously cleaning a massive sniper rifle. "Petty Officer Davis goes with you." A wave of smirks and barely suppressed snorts rippled through the team. At 4 feet 9 inches, Elena Davis looked less like a special operator and more like a high schooler who had wandered onto a military base. She was barely a whisper of a woman, with slender arms and a calm, almost serene expression that seemed wildly out of place in the testosterone-heavy room. "With all due respect, sir," drawled Jones, a towering operator with a thick beard and biceps the size of her thighs. "A doll can't fight. This is a direct action raid. We're going to be kicking down doors and taking fire. She's a liability." Davis didn't flinch. She continued running a bore snake through the barrel of her M107, a rifle that was nearly as long as she was tall. The .50 caliber weapon, capable of turning an engine block into scrap metal, looked absurdly large in her small hands. "She's not kicking down doors," Mark said, his voice flat, leaving no room for argument. "She's our insurance policy. She sets up on the high ground, covers the approach. She's the best shot in this entire theater of operations. Her record speaks for itself." "Record?" Another SEAL, Callahan, scoffed under his breath. "Record for what? Winning a marksmanship contest at boot camp?" Davis finally looked up. Her eyes weren't angry. They were the color of the winter sky, clear and profoundly, unnervingly calm. They held the kind of stillness you see in a predator right before it strikes. She looked directly at Callahan, then at Jones. She didn't say a word. She just looked at them, and for a second, the jeering stopped. It wasn't a challenge, it was an assessment. She had already calculated the distance, the windage, and the drop, filing them away in a mental log she'd never use. The Black Hawk helicopter thundered through the Afghan sky, the rotors a frantic heartbeat against the canvas of dusk. Inside, the tension was a physical entity. The SEALs went through their final weapons checks, the metallic clicks and snaps a grim symphony of impending violence. Davis sat strapped in by the open door, the wind whipping her short, dark hair. She held her rifle vertically, the butt resting on the floor, her eyes fixed on the jagged peaks on the horizon. Jones leaned over, his voice raised to be heard over the rotors. "Hey, Davis, you see that?" He pointed out the door to the landscape below, a chaotic jumble of rock and shadow. "That's the Shock Valley. When we land, you find your little rock. We'll be doing the real work." He clapped her on the shoulder, a little harder than necessary. "Just try to keep up, kid." Davis turned to him, her expression unchanged. She simply nodded once. She wasn't interested in his approval. She was interested in the data, the wind speed, the fading light, the topography of the valley that was rushing up to meet them. The insertion was hot. The pilot set the bird down in a wadi, a dry riverbed that offered the only flat ground for miles. The SEALs poured out, a wave of black-clad violence, and immediately began bounding towards the village, a cluster of mud-brick buildings clinging to the side of a steep mountain. Davis was the last one out. She didn't follow them. She moved in the opposite direction, a small, swift shadow scrambling up the loose scree of a parallel ridgeline. Her load was immense, the rifle, a spotter's scope, extra ammunition, water, but she moved with an economy of motion that was breathtaking. She was a mountain goat, finding handholds and footholds that seemed invisible. Her small frame and low center of gravity an advantage, not a hindrance. From her perch, 500 meters above the valley floor and 2,000 meters from the village, she had a panoramic view. She could see the SEAL team advancing, using rocks for cover. She could see the village, quiet, deceptively peaceful. And through her scope, she could see what they couldn't: movement on the far side of the village. A group of men, armed with PKM machine guns and RPGs, were setting up a hasty ambush along the only path that led to the village square. The radio in her ear crackled. Jones's voice breathy with exertion. "Approaching target building. No visual on tangos yet." Davis keyed her mic. Her voice was soft, a whisper in the storm of their adrenaline. "Alpha Actual, this is Echo. You have 9 hostiles moving to your 9 o'clock. They are setting up a heavy weapons position 200 meters beyond your primary target. They have clear line of sight on your approach. I say again, they have a clear line of sight." A beat of silence. Then the voice of the team leader, a man named Reynolds, came back, laced with skepticism. "Echo, confirm. 9? We have no eyes on. The village is a ghost town." "Confirmed 9, Davis replied, her voice never wavering. "They are masked from your position by the terrain. They are setting up behind a low wall adjacent to the mosque." "Copy, Echo," Reynolds said, the skepticism still palpable. "Hold for assessment." Davis watched through her scope as the SEAL team paused. She could see Jones gesturing angrily towards the ridgeline, probably saying something about a delusional doll. She could see the indecision. The threat of an ambush versus the intelligence on the execution. It was a commander's nightmare. Then, the world exploded. A rocket-propelled grenade screamed from the ambush position, slamming into a building just ahead of the SEALs, showering them with debris. The chatter of PKMs erupted, a terrifying, ripping canvas sound that echoed off the mountains. Tracer fire, like angry red hornets, sliced through the dusk, stitching the ground where the SEALs had been standing moments before. The ambush had been sprung early, triggered by the team's pause, but it was just as deadly. The SEALs were pinned down, their advance halted, trapped in a shallow depression with minimal cover. "Contact front! Contact front!" Reynolds' voice screamed over the radio, now strained with urgency. "We are pinned! Heavy fire from the mosque! I need suppressing fire now!" The other SEALs returned fire, their M4s spitting hot lead, but they were outgunned. The heavy machine guns of the enemy chewed through their cover, forcing them to keep their heads down. They couldn't maneuver. They couldn't retreat. They were caught in a kill box. On the ridgeline, Davis took a deep, cleansing breath. The jeers from the helicopter echoed in her mind. "A doll can't fight." She ignored them. The chaos of the firefight, the screaming, the explosions, it all faded into a dull, ambient hum. Her world narrowed to a single point of focus. She peered through the loopholed Mark IV scope, her eye finding the reticle. The first target, a gunner behind a PKM, was clearly visible, his torso exposed as he poured fire down on the trapped men. She adjusted for wind. It was erratic, gusting up the valley at 15 knots, then shifting. She calculated the Coriolis effect, the spin of the Earth that would alter the bullet's trajectory over such an extreme distance. She estimated the angle, the drop. Her target was at 2,200 meters, a shot that most snipers would consider the pinnacle of their career, attempted only in perfect conditions. This was not a perfect condition. The light was gone. The wind was a devil. She squeezed the trigger. The recoil of the M107 was a massive punch, but her small frame was braced perfectly, absorbing it, letting the rifle settle. 2 seconds later, a full 2.2 seconds for the bullet to travel that impossible distance, the gunner's head snapped back, and he crumpled behind his weapon. The PKM fell silent. The effect on the ground was instantaneous. One of the enemy machine guns stopped firing. The SEALs, momentarily stunned, took advantage of the lull to shift positions. On the ridgeline, Davis was already moving. She acquired her second target, an RPG gunner preparing to fire. Another breath. Another adjustment. The wind gusted harder, whipping sand into her face, stinging her eyes. She blinked it away, her focus absolute. She fired. The RPG gunner spun and fell. Down in the valley, Jones risked a glance up at the ridgeline. He couldn't see her, but he knew she was there. "Holy shit," he breathed. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't a scoff. It was pure, unadulterated awe. But their problems were far from over. The remaining 7 fighters, realizing they were under fire from an unseen assassin, reacted with panicked fury. They doubled their rate of fire, spraying blindly in Davis's general direction. More dangerously, they began to maneuver, using the village's rubble and walls to break her line of sight. The window was closing. Davis shifted targets. A fighter running between 2 buildings. He was only visible for a fraction of a second. She tracked him, led him, and fired. The bullet, a finger of pure destruction, met him mid-stride. The SEALs, emboldened by the sudden shift in momentum, began to push forward, using Davis's cover fire to advance from one piece of cover to the next. A deadly dance was unfolding. The enemy would try to flank, and Davis would find them. One tried to circle around through a dry irrigation ditch. She found the top of his head and the curve of his back and sent a round that ended his advance permanently. The wind was now a full-blown sandstorm. Visibility was dropping to near zero. The air was thick with grit, making it impossible to see more than a few hundred meters with the naked eye. Dust devils swirled through the valley. For the SEALs, it was a nightmare. For Davis, it was a different kind of challenge. She was no longer shooting at men. She was shooting at ghosts, at heat signatures that flickered in and out of existence through her thermal scope, at the briefest of movements in the swirling brown haze. She relied on instinct honed by 1,000,000 rounds downrange, on a spatial awareness that seemed almost supernatural. The enemy fighters, now terrified and disoriented, made a fatal mistake. They clustered together, seeking cover and orders from their leader behind the same thick mud brick wall. It was a poor choice. The wall offered protection from small arms fire. It offered no protection from a .50 caliber round fired from over 2 miles away. Davis's spotter, a young man named Ortega, who had been feeding her wind calls and adjustments, identified the cluster. "Echo, I have multiple heat sources, behind the wall at the northeast corner of the mosque. Looks like they're regrouping." Davis saw them. 5, maybe 6 distinct orange blobs in her scope huddled close. The wall was thick, maybe 2 feet of packed mud. A standard round might not penetrate, but she wasn't using standard rounds. She was firing Rolfes MK211 multi-purpose rounds. They were designed to penetrate light armor and then explode. She took her time. The wind was a screaming banshee. Her calculations were now less science and more art, a desperate equation of probability and faith. She aimed not at a man, but at a point on the wall just above where the heat signatures were most concentrated. She squeezed the trigger. The round screamed across the valley, a tiny meteor defiant against the storm. It struck the wall. The initial impact cratered the mud. The penetrating core punched through, and then the explosive incendiary charge detonated directly behind it, right in the middle of the cluster of fighters. The explosion was a sharp, violent cough of orange flame in the brown haze. When the smoke cleared, the heat signatures behind the wall were gone. Silence. Not the silence of peace, but the sudden, shocking silence that follows a cataclysmic event. The enemy fire had stopped. All of it. The sandstorm continued to rage, but the man-made storm of lead was over. The SEALs, crouched behind their rocks, waited for a long moment, ears ringing, hearts pounding. Nothing moved in the village. Reynolds's voice came over the radio, ragged with disbelief. "Echo, status on hostiles?" Davis lowered her head from the scope for the first time. The muscles in her neck screamed. Her shoulder was a deep, throbbing ache. She blinked the grit from her eyes and looked at Ortega. He was staring at her, his mouth slightly open. She keyed her mic. "Alpha Actual, all 9 hostiles are down. The village is secure." The journey back to the helicopter was a silent one. The SEALs moved through the village, past the positions where the enemy had fallen, and they saw the evidence of the impossible. The shots had come from so far away that the angle was almost flat. Men had been struck down by an unseen hand of God. The wall at the northeast corner of the mosque had a small, clean hole on the outside and a gaping, jagged crater on the inside. When they reached the landing zone, Davis was already there, sitting on a rock, her massive rifle across her lap. She was sipping water from a camelback, her face smeared with dust and cordite. She looked tired, small, and utterly unremarkable. The SEALs trudged up to her, their boots heavy in the sand. Jones was in the lead. He stopped a few feet from her, his huge frame blocking the weak moonlight. He looked down at her, his face unreadable. He reached up and pulled off his helmet, running a hand through his sweat-matted hair. Then, he did something no one expected. He walked over and gently took the heavy rifle from her lap, slinging it over his own shoulder. The other SEALs followed suit, each one finding a piece of her gear to carry, her pack, her ammunition can, her spotting scope. They didn't say a word. They didn't need to. They formed a protective circle around her, the smallest among them, and they walked her to the waiting Blackhawk. As the helicopter lifted off, leaving the shock valley to the darkness and the wind, Jones sat across from her. The roar of the rotors filled the cabin. He leaned forward, his voice a low rumble that barely cut through the noise. "I'm sorry," he said. Just that, 2 words. But in his eyes was the profound respect of a warrior who had witnessed the purest form of his craft. Davis looked at him, the same calm, winter sky eyes. She gave him a single, small nod. It was an acceptance, not just of his apology, but of the new reality. She was no longer a doll. She was the guardian angel who had descended from a sandstorm on a mountain of fire, a legend born in the chaos of the Shock Valley, a story the SEALs would tell for the rest of their lives, the day they were saved by the quietest, smallest person on the battlefield.